share my presentation as I have a PowerPoint. I hope you can see. So since she spoke about she covered the UK detention system, I will focus more on the Italian and Portuguese part. And so I will present some empirical evidence I collected throughout the years of my engagement in the field, as I said, as a researcher, but also, and before that, as a feminist advocate and activist with BeFree. And I'm so honored that today there is Francesca De Masi from BeFree, and also Enrica Rigo, who are really on the field at the front of this struggle. So now going to the core of my presentation, I will show some material and use a feminist intersectional approach to analyze this and try to show how gendered, racialized, and sexualized construction affect women's everyday life in detention, but also how these constructions are reappropriated, reconfigured, and strategically used by women themselves to survive and challenge the system. And I think it's very much related to what Aminata has been saying. And I think the final goal is also to demonstrate the key role of gendered and racialized notions of vulnerability and dangerousness in the operation of the detention system, and the importance also to challenge them. So just very briefly, I have here some pictures just to let you know, because I thought we could have an international audience, so that cannot be familiar. These are some pictures of Rome Detention Center, and I'm sure Francesca will later speak about this, just to show you the kind of prison-like environment it is. And it's the only detention center in Italy which currently detained also women. And the other center I've been doing my activity, it's the Sant'Antonio Housing Unit in Porto, which is, as Joao Costa yesterday mentioned, is the sole detention facility in the Portuguese territory, designed to confine people subject to immigration control. And it's managed by the Portuguese Immigration Border Services, and it's a much smaller facility. So going now to my presentation. So what I observed during my field work is mainly that inside Ponte Galeria, women were often divided by staff members into good and bad. So good women were the harmless ones, those who did not give problems to the staff and fitted within the normative standards of femininity. And in contrast, the bad women were somehow the troublesome, being those who transgressed traditional gender and sexual roles, and whom staff found more difficult to manage. Nationality as a means by which the staff managed the hyperdiversity of the detention population was further used to articulate such stereotypical division in a racialized way. So for instance, Russian, Ukrainians, and even Georgians women were often regarded as quiet and disciplined detainees, honest women who had come to Italy to do domestic and care work, while conversely, Nigerian women who often made their living as sex workers or who were trafficked and then forced to do sex work were considered by staff as aggressive and hypersexualized. And this representation somehow evoked the figure of the angry Black woman, Sapphire, described as unintelligent, aggressive, emasculating, but also the Jezebel, a hypersexual, animalistic, and promiscuous female who cannot be controlled. So, like Precious, and of course I'm not using true names, told me in a conversation we had, they see Nigerian people and they say, what? Puttana, or the look at you. So notably, as my colleague Gaia Giuliano observes, these figures of race which sediment over time and crystallize some of the meanings assigned to gendered and racialized bodies stem from national and transnational colonial archives, but are also locally contextualized. So for instance, in Portugal, these figures of race were articulated differently according to the country's colonial history, in particular the ideology of Lusotropicalism that informed it. And I don't have time to expand on this, but I'm happy to do it in the Q&A. So So it's in the context of this historical background and the ways colonial hierarchies were elaborated over time through this gendered opposition of civilization savagery that Brazilian women who migrate to Portugal today, especially those working in the sex industry, are constructed as hypersexualized bodies. And Beatriz Padilla, Mariana Salister Gomez, and Gleiciani Fernandez argue all Brazilian women married or single, more or less young, because they're Brazilian, they're seen as potential prostitutes. These women, as those who come to Portugal, interestedly, to marry Portuguese men. So the experience of Francielle, a Brazilian woman I met in detention in Porto, well illuminate these issues, I think. She had been apprehended by the police during her night work, and recalling these episodes, she described an excess of authority and feeling of having been treated like a criminal. And in her conversation with me, she complained, Portuguese don't like us Brazilians a lot. Some security guards, she believed, enjoyed seeing her suffer. And overall, she associated her experience in detention with the broader discrimination suffered by Brazilian people in Portugal, and in particular, the gender stereotype of Brazilian women seducing Portuguese men to take advantage of their financial resources. Despite these differences between these two contexts, interestingly enough, the notion of good and bad detainees was deeply intertwined with the concept of vulnerability and dangerousness, and subsequently with ideas of whether or not women deserve to be detained. So the good women perceived as vulnerable were regarded as victims of the detention system, unjustly locked up and thus deserving staff compassion. And while empathy and compassion easily flourished with them, emotional connections were much more difficult instead to create with men, particularly those with criminal records. So this distinction between victims, good migrants, and dangerous subjects, bad migrants, with the latter deserving detention, was constantly reproduced in staff narratives. And such distinction was also clearly gendered. So for instance, these are some field notes of an interaction I had with a social worker in the area who told me very angry, by the police bring us domestic servants who don't bother anyone. Instead, they do socially useful jobs. Instead, women are all domestic servants and all women come from prisons. And then after 6 months here, the men manage to get out, whereas the women are deported. So I think I argue that episodes like this one, and this is just an example, reveal how staff members generally regarded women as harmless victims of the system, unjustly locked up and therefore deserving of greater empathy and compassion. However, exceptions were made, particularly in the case of women who had criminal records or who used to make their living as sex workers. So by transgressing traditional gender and sexual roles or by refusing to passively complying with detention rules, thus proving to be ungrateful guests, these women were considered by staff as deviant and troublesome. So simply put, by refusing to embody the status of the inferiorized victims, they were reverted into potential criminals. And consequently, their confinement and eventual deportation were not perceived so ethically challenging. So for instance, this is an excerpt of an interview I had with a cultural mediator at Ponte Galeria. Again, the name is not his true name, but what is interesting here is that again, it compared the figure of the prison, the delinquents, with the prison of the poor woman, the caregiver, the poor lady who has nothing to do with prostitutions, with drugs, with criminality, and who has to be imprisoned and eventually deported. Yet, even when women actually fall under the category of the victims, such as in the case of trafficking survivors, similar mechanisms of objection and dispossession were deployed. And I will not extend a lot on this because I'm sure Francesca later and Enrica will definitely mention this. And so I'm gonna cut this part. This is just a case of some years ago in which, again, I was doing my field work in Ponte Galeria, and also Enrique and Francesca were involved. I think it was very illustrative of these mechanisms of dispossession and objections. And in general, what Aminata was saying, this violence of asking women to demonstrate that they are providing a credible stories and that they fit in this narrative of the perfect victim. Beyond this specific case, however, the tendency of authorities to doubt the genuineness of women's accounts, especially when this account presents some gaps, as is normal, emerged frequently in my work, both in Italy and Portugal, coupled with the idea that women were involved in trafficking networks, but did not want to share information about these networks. And this was also the case of several asylum-seeking women who arrived in Portugal from sub-Saharan Africa and were found pregnant. The risk of exploitation, not only of the women, but also and primarily of the future babies, was the main argument used by immigration authorities to justify their detention. However, while gender and racialized norms and expectations clearly affected everyday life in detention, as I think I demonstrated, women also navigated this system by adhering and reproducing, but also reappropriating and performing hegemonic constructions of femininity and vulnerability. So, for example, when I spoke with Elena, the Brazilian woman I met in Porto Detention Center, she was 4 months pregnant, and she criticized the fact that her vulnerability as a woman undergoing a risky pregnancy was not acknowledged by center staff. And so during our conversation, she explained to me that inside the center, she felt sick, but the staff did not believe her complaints and refused to take her to the hospital. And angry about this situation, she claimed that the body was hers and that she was the only one who knew what she was actually feeling. And in such claims, she used her condition as a pregnant woman and for this reason vulnerable to denounce the unfairness of the detention system and claim her rights, especially health and care. And overall for her, Helena, the medical certificate for a risky pregnancy was the main tool to cause her deportation because she was not able to travel in this condition to Brazil and she could be affected by the Zika virus. Another woman I met and she was pregnant again was Anna from Nigeria. And again, she strategically used the gender construction about women's pregnancy and its related vulnerability to challenge the harsh regime of detention. And overall, I argue that these claims, and according to what Mary said in her presentation, are very political in their nature. And even nonetheless, they are often seen by detention staff as illegitimate and childlike, thus revealing an infantilizing view of detained women and also patronizing attitude towards them. By displaying this complex volition, women, which range from claims to be recognized as right bearers and non-compliance with detention rules to self-harm, protests, and riots, women in detention disconfirm their expected behavior as grateful guests, and in other words, as victims stripped of subjectivity. And I want just to share with you some examples of women's resistance in detention. So this is a picture of Nigerian women celebrating a release. And they use this freedom song and they used to dance and sing together where someone was released from detention. And also the paintings in the living units and the sectors which challenge the grayness and impersonality of the detention environment and were also a way to put forward claims to make them visible to staff, but also to other detainees also coming next. And the main aim was freedom, which is the main aim of people in detention, and usually protests always start with the goal of claiming such a right, including, I could recall here several protests, but I can't for reason of time, but just to mention the last one during the COVID-19 period and the lockdown in which women at the end of March started an hunger and thirst strike in Ponte Galeria to demand improvement of conditions because they didn't feel safe and also to end their confinement. And finally, the last form of resistance, and then I'm wrapping up. I know, Mary, I'm running out of time. It's also the physical confrontation which women put in place against against detention staff, and also during the deportation operations. And so, for example, in this excerpt, these women speak about a collective resistance of Nigerian women who take off their clothes to fight and resist deportation. So I think basically these are my conclusions. I will maybe speak more about this, but I think it's just important to center this dichotomy between victimization and constructions of criminality, and also the importance of solidarity in detention as a means to challenge and undermine this system. And I think I will stop here, and then I'm happy to speak in the Q&A. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Francesca. That was great, and very much to time. So now our third presenter is going to stick with Italy. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Enrica Rigo from the Rome Legal Clinic. Enrica is Associate Professor at the University of Roma Tre, where she holds the chair in philosophy of law and coordinates a legal clinic program on migration and asylum. Over the last 2 decades, Enrica has been involved as an activist in the Italian and European movement in support of migrants' rights and in the Italian feminist movement, Non Una di Meno. Today, Enrica will be talking to us about a gendered approach to freedom of movement's restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. First of all, I want to thank the organizer of this panel and Mary as the chair. I have some slides to show, so I try to, okay. Okay. My presentation will be quite brief, and because I would like to set a number of questions, maybe also for the discussion. And I will place women detention in the broader approach that interrogates what is at stake in freedom of movement restriction through a gender perspective. So I will try to interrogate the relation between mobility and the reproduction of life in a gender perspective. I will provide 3 pictures of mobility constraint from different years, going from the so-called refugee crisis to the pandemic crisis, to reflect on what happens after detention and deportation, to reflect on multiple constraints and the ambivalence of mobility limitation. I will use as an entry point, we show now a brief video of a Nigerian woman. We will only hear the voice. I will name her Beloved. Actually, is one of the 69 women Francesca was referring to, detained in Ponte Galeria, who was deported from Italy in September 2015, while the appeal against her asylum case was still pending. And despite a court decision that had suspended their deportation, so it was an illegal deportation. Although the legal system did not provide Beloved with a remedy to enforce her right to stay in Italy, in 2016, she was able to come back to Italy by being smuggled again through the desert and crossing again the Mediterranean in a lapa-lapa, which is the word that Nigerian women use for the boats. And okay, it's only a couple of minutes of an interview.
Did they were deported? Yeah. Actually, nothing. They didn't tell us anything. The whole gate was locked. And they passed us breakfast from the gate. But most of us didn't eat. Then they called our names. I almost killed myself. So they took us to a place to sign. I didn't sign. So they now tied our hand. Then they now searched our body. Then they gave us slippers and shoes. Then gave us our bag. Then took us to the bus. Then after to the airport where we boarded the plane to go to Nigeria. So after we left the place, that was around 12 p.m. So they now left us with our bag. So we now find our way out of the airport. They're not on police uniform. The warders, those that works in airports, I think. It's not warders or warden. I don't know what they call them. Well, I think people that work with migration, I think so. So they left us there with our things that they gave us from Lampedusa. Because when we got to Lampedusa, they gave us bags with clothes and shampoo. So we now carried it. Then they now said that if we don't leave that moment, that if the police should catch us, that they'll go and lock us in prison.
How many were you the first time you crossed the sea?
135.
135.
Yes, 135.
And how many of you arrived alive?
All. We all, because that night was just one boat that the man pushed, just fully our boat. But this second one, it was 4 boats that the man pushed. It was the 3rd boat that baby I was telling you, we are the last boat, the 4th one for that day, and then most of them in that boat died. But in our own boat, just one person, because the place was tight, no food, and filled with water. It was leaking, so we bailed water till we saw rescue. The day they were deported.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I wanted to show this interview because we have this tendency to represent borders and also detention camps as a threshold for one-way journey. But actually the reality is quite different, as we know. Anyway, in 2015, the first asylum application of Beloved was refused on the grounds that although she's been forced into prostitution in Libya, and you can see here the decision, she managed to escape from the connection house, the brothel. And as a consequence, the Territorial Commission for Asylum argued that she voluntarily departed from Italy. After a return to Italy in 2016 and during her second asylum procedure, she was asked several times by the Commission if she was sexually assaulted during the journey. She was a point they wanted to know in order to grant her asylum or international protection. And indeed, the Beloved was quite proud that she had been able to escape violence during her second journey. And while the Commission pressed her because she wanted to know how she came back, she kept replying that she already knew the way. This is a quote from the minutes of the Commission interview. So at this point, Beloved, I want to tell also the end of the story, was granted asylum in 2019 after 4 years, and now she works as a care worker for a wage of €2 per hour. She's working in Turin at this point. So I want to set here my first set of questions. I want to pose my first set of questions. Beloved is today contributing to the supply of reproductive labor on a global scale. Of course, she was supplying reproductive labor even when she was forced into prostitution. She was supplying sexual labor, even though this is not the right kind of activity that allow entry in a territory. Yet my question here is, to what extent has mobility been and continue to be an essential element of our own reproduction? How is important for the reproduction of our own life? And how far this perspective enable us to understand what is at stake in mobility control? Since 2014, the number of women who have sought asylum in Italy increased 4 times, from less than 5,000 to 21,000. Of course, as we all know, this number dropped dramatically after 2017, when the Mediterranean border was closed through a memorandum of understanding between Italy and the Libyan government of national accord. Normally, gender mainstreaming policies apply once a woman is inside Europe. But what happens at the border? Does the violence deployed by border pose a gender question? If we look at also official document, the EU migration agenda, we see that the gender question applies, according only inside the EU, while the external control affect indiscriminately all the groups, regardless gender or other vulnerability. So the second picture of mobility constraints that I want to present comes from Benin City, where I was in February 2020, and I met several women who had been returned from Libya during the previous months. Normally, the numbers outside Europe rarely enter into the discourse. Although more than 50,000 Nigerians were repatriated from Libya to Nigeria since 2015, and more than 32,000 migrants intercepted at sea were repatriated to Libya by the Libyan Coast Guard were returned since 2017. So I met around 10 women in Benin City, and some of them had already experienced deportation from Europe in previous years. Nevertheless, all of them represented the period in Libya as a dramatic rupture in their mobility experience. Besides sexual exploitation in connection houses and detention in Libya camps, all the women, really all of them, recalled the attempts to cross the Mediterranean several times and the capture by the Libyan Coast Guard, which returned them to the detention and exploitation, sexual exploitation as well, to pay the next part of the journey. So my second set of questions tackle exactly this point. To what extent the multiplication of borders also multiplies perpetrators and victims in relation of exploitation? How much this complicates the picture when we think about exploitation, for example, in the case of trafficked women. to what extent the very notion of exploitation and its legal translation, which is centered upon the lack of consent, is called into question by the multiplication of labor. In the book Borders as Method, Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nilsson use the category of multiplication of labor to describe the effects of borders in relation to capital expansion. My question here is, to what extent, besides labor regimes, borders also multiply regimes of reproduction? The reference that I make here is to the feminist category of social reproduction, which has been used to criticize and call into question the very distinction between a productive and a reproductive sphere that is also mirrored in the legal construction, for example, when we distinguish between economic and forced migration. My last picture of mobility constraint come from the pandemic crisis. The outbreak of the pandemic crisis brought to the forefront also a crisis of reproduction, to the extent that sectors such as health, education, food security have been hit by the pandemic crisis. It is the very reproduction of society that has been put into question. And the question that I think is important to pose is, what's the relation between mobility and reproduction? All countries during the pandemic have introduced mobility restriction to limit the diffusion of the virus. But mobility restriction also meant limitation to the right to search for salvation. I could have taken many pictures of these, for example, from the Greek island. I go back again to the detention center of Ponte Galeria. Differently from other countries, Italy did not release detainees during the pandemic crisis, not even from administrative detention, so not even migrants in administrative detention. Nevertheless, deciding on individual cases, several tribunals release migrants, grounding the decision exactly on the limitation to the freedom of movement which had been introduced during the pandemic, so the limitation to travel, stating that a reasonable prospect of removal no longer existed. So here again, of course, the relationship between mobility and the reproduction of life emerge in an ambivalent manner. So my last question is if social reproduction can be understood as a lens to read mobility constraints in a gender perspective. And to what extent mobility has to do with the reproduction of body and minds located in historical times and geographical spaces. This is definition definition of social reproduction taken from Antonella Picchio, which of course also refers to the reproduction of social and gendered relations. I give my own answer in the Caliban and the Witch. Silvia Federici showed us the subjugation of women to the reproduction of the workforce has been part of the primitive accumulation process through which capital expropriated workers from their means of subsistence. And I believe that what is at stake today in the control of human mobility is part of this very same process. At the same time, this is also what makes the practice of freedom of movement a radical political practice. I had another video of 2 minutes, but I think I ran out of time. So maybe we can show this video later, which is another voice of detained women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrica. Yes, I'm afraid we need to move on. But if we have time at the end, we can play that. So our next speaker is Francesca De Masi, who is the Vice President of BeFree, a social cooperative against trafficking, violence, and discrimination that operates in Rome, I believe. Francesca De Masi has been working with women survivors of violence and trafficking since 1999, including women detained inside the detention camp in Ponte Galeria in Rome. She's the BeFree anti-trafficking director and manages a shelter for women escaping from experiences of sexual exploitation. And Francesca is going to talk to us about the work of feminist organizations inside detention sites. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks all of you. First of all, sorry for my English. I will try to be as understandable as I can. As Mary told before, BeFree is a women association, a feminist association in 2007 with a focus on the fight against male violence toward the women, and with the focus even to women trafficking and discrimination. The whole association work is based on a gender-based perspective, through which these situations are analyzed, starting from the assumption that they are not neutral phenomena, but they are deeply connected to the hierarchical power relationship between men and women, and to the structuring of asymmetrical social role flattened on categories of domination for men and subordination for women. The long-standing methodological cornerstone of the feminist approach as a political practice is the relationship between women. Women were the first to name the violence they suffered inside the privacy of their home. And they were the first to understand that this has very little to do with their private sphere, but this is the direct result of the prevailing mainstream culture which legitimizes and perpetuates this violence. So there is a connection between the violence perpetrated by men individually and the general daily oppression of women caused by their position in the society. So the services against trafficking and against violence managed by BeFree are driven by the awareness that there is no neutrality when we deal with these phenomena, with the phenomena, for example, of migration or of trafficking in human being. I am speaking about this for a very important reason, and for a very important question. what does this way of looking at the world practically imply for the anti-violence and anti-trafficking counseling female operators? This is very important when we meet the women who refer to our services because they are in need of help about a situation of domestic violence or trafficking in human being. It involves the fact that the operator and the woman, despite their diversity and the uniqueness of their biography, share at least one piece of experience, which is that gender oppression. The shared experience of gender oppression is what makes a little bound between operator and the woman we meet. A piece of shared experience that obviously must not flatten the unrepeatability of the biographies of each woman, and must absolutely not wipe out the different positions that instead clearly distance a Western and white female operator from a woman for whom gender oppression is only one of the multiple oppressions that she experiences daily on her skin. A piece of shared experience that cannot and must not ignore the dynamics of power obviously existing in the relationship between the white and the Western female operator born in the exploiting part of the world and the supported woman who instead comes from the other side of the world, which has always been exploited by the former. A piece of shared experience which can, however, represent a starting point for building a bond, even if bitter, and a successive alliance between women. BeFree work inside detention camp or even in other places like Territorial Commission for the Recognition of International Protection, the courts, the reception center for asylum seekers, the hospital, and so on. This kind of work has the aim to bring out women's stories of life when they are yet unspeakable, when they are yet submerged, in order to direct the women toward personalized projects, including psychosocial and legal support and housing assistance. Now let's get to the tricky part. How to apply a gendered methodology like the one I have just described in a place like an administrative detention camp, a place that structurally denies the complexity of the lives of the women who are detained there, as well as that forced camp. And I have to excuse me because is the translation of an Italian expression that is campo di forza, that is the name used by an academic who wrote a book. The name is Alessandra Sciurba, and she speaks about campi di forza, that I translate forced camp, in which individual aspiration for freedom collide in a fight to the death with the constriction and the harnessing of our migration management system. How it's possible to apply this kind of methodology? When we started going every week to the Ponte Galeria camp in 2008, we asked ourselves this kind of question, even in a very conflicting way. We were used to do our work in places that had nothing to do with that detention center. We were used to work inside the shelters, inside the anti-violence center, and we asked ourselves how to overcome, and if overcomable at all, the multiple critical issues that such place confronted us with. First of all, the ambiguity of our role. How can we practice that political relationship between women that has given so much strength to the methodology of an anti-violence center in such an overwhelming context? For Nigerian women who over the years have been those most present within the detention camp and those we have thus followed the most, who we are for the Nigerian women, who we do represent, what power do we have over them, and especially what power do they think that we have over them. Unraveling this ambiguity, or at least trying to unravel it, is a difficult exercise of continuous negotiation and continuous search for an authenticity that, for the very structure of a place like the detention camp, is almost impossible to reach. The detention center is the place where the violence, the state violence, as Aminata told us before, the violence of European migration policies established the failure of the migration project of men and women who are detained. On Friday, for example, I think that surely you spoke in the last days about it. The news has spread of yet another suicide occurred inside the camp in Torino. Musa Balde, 23 years old, from Guinea, committed suicide after being locked up inside the camp in the aftermath of a violent racist attack suffered in Ventimiglia, another city of Italy, 10 days early. Taken to the hospital, he was then immediately brought to the detention center, kept in isolation due to unspecified health reason for which no further details are given on the pages of the few newspapers that covered the news. Few newspapers which in several cases did not even bother to specify his name and surname. For women survivors of trafficking who are locked up inside the camp, the concept of danger plays a crucial role of contention and mystifying and contradictory meaning. Dangerous themselves when they find themselves locked up due to the prevailing rhetoric according to which all irregular persons represent the danger of invasion. Inside the camp, they are dangerous. When they are outside the detention center, they become those in danger, those unable to save themselves from the network of traffickers, squeezed between victimization and the desire for pervasive control over their lives, because they are considered unable to manage the life in a conscious way, in a safe way, and they are in need, they are considered in need to be saved even by themselves, according to a colonial approach which cancels any possibility of agency and their role as a political subject. Understanding the story, the women's story of life, in order to identify them, it's a bad word, but this is the word used by Italian system of anti-trafficking network. In order to identify them as victims I prefer to speak about them like survivors of trafficking in human beings, is not the priority of our system. There is, for example, a little consideration for the self-identification process carried out by the survivors. In general, even if a person declares directly that she is a survivor of trafficking and exploitation, there is a lack of trust shown toward the migrants by the institution involved that delegate the anti-trafficking association to the burden of certifying the condition of a victim of trafficking. Even this is a colonial approach. Can this colonial approach be avoided in a place like Ponte Galeria? It's very difficult, especially because we have very tight margins of maneuver between legislative system and control management that seem to leave no space for the women's powerful aspiration for freedom. I think that there is a margin for action, and that is the reason why, after more than 10 years from our first entry into the camp, we still find a meaning to return week after week. At least until last year, when the pandemic blocked the access of organizations to the center, which is still forbidden today. We were told that women detained during the lockdown were few, that they were decreasing more and more, and therefore there was not need for our presence inside the camp. Yet among the few women detained at the time, one of them in September 2020 attempted suicide inside the camp and was hospitalized at the San Camillo Forlanini Hospital, where BeFree was able to reach her just because we managed another help desk, different help desk inside the Department of Emergency. She is a Tunisian woman brought to Ponte Galeria after a few days upon her arrival in Italy. And when the woman became aware of having been subjected to an expulsion decree, she was overwhelmed by the terror of finding herself in the condition of suffering the same abuses from where she was escaping. She legitimately felt her life was in danger because she was about to be deported to Tunisia. I don't want to be very long, but this woman was able, thanks to the collaboration of different actors, to not re-enter inside the detention camp and to get an appointment for the request of protection from outside of the detention camp. However, and this is a good news, she never arrived at the immigration office. The evening before the appointment, she ran away from the reception center we managed to find for her in order to reach Germany. We learn about Germany later. This is yet another proof that luckily, sometimes our obtuse migration policies do not succeed in harnessing women's will and their power to make choices for themselves. So I say goodbye to her, and I wish for her the better life she can have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca, and it's nice to end your presentation with a positive outcome, since so much of what we've been hearing over the last 2 days has been extremely heart-wrenching and also very angering. So we're now coming back to the United Kingdom in our presenters and in the topic. So the next presenter will be Kate Alexander. Kate is a PhD student at the University of Glasgow and director of Scottish Detainee Visitors, which is a small charity that supports people who are detained in Scotland's only detention centre, which is known as Dungavel. Kate will be talking to us about fathers and immigration detention, narratives of love and powerlessness. So over to you, Kate.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Yes, so I'm going to talk about emerging themes from my PhD, which, as Mary said, examines the experience of fathers detained by the Immigration Service in the UK. And I draw on the work of scholars in the field of legal consciousness to focus on the emotions of love and powerlessness experienced by these men. Oh, I can't move it on. Yes, I can. So my research is based on qualitative interviews with 12 fathers who were detained when I spoke to them or had been released from detention. They're an under-researched group, but as a practitioner working for Scottish Detainee Visitors and visiting people in Dungavel, I've met numerous fathers over the years who've been in detention and are missing their children. And that was really the impetus for this piece of work. Some of those men that I met over the years were participants in this research, actually 3 of them, many years after I met them in Dungavel. So there's much more research on fathers in prison than fathers in detention, and this literature is useful as the 2 groups share many experiences, but there are differences, and a key difference is that in contrast to fathers in prison, encouraging positive relationships with fathers in detention doesn't serve any policy goals. And in fact, it may militate against the goals of detention, which basically relate to removing men who are seen to be problematic and sometimes dangerous. And that profoundly affects the experience of fathers in detention. Move this on. So just a word or two about legal consciousness. It refers to the ways in which people experience, understand and act in relation to the law. And it's already been examined in the context of immigration detention by Singer in her 2019 study of LGBT people who've been released from detention. She describes their experience as desert island detention, the desert island evoking the kind of sense of the law being all pervasive. It's the reason they're there trapped. But it's also somehow out of reach across the sea. People can't get access to legal advice, to information, to support, and sometimes even to a phone signal. And her study wasn't focused on emotion in any way, but reading it, I was really struck by that the experience of her participants was highly emotional. It was the consequence of the uncertainty of life lived under immigration control. And that's very much echoed in my own study. So just to move on to one of the emotions, paternal love and aspects of that. The literature on incarcerated fathers shows that they think good fathers are those who are available to their children. They pay attention to them. They both provide economically for their children and care for them. And there's an element of control and discipline as well. And the thoughts of the fathers in my study closely reflected that literature. In the first quote here, Ochuko describes what he considers the role of a father to be. So he says, being a father is to be there for my sons, physically, emotionally, financially, academically, and spiritually. So the first thing he mentions is being there, but for him that encompasses caring, breadwinning, and guiding his children as well. But absence could also be an expression of love. Again, in common with some of the fathers in the prisons literature, several also spoke of how they chose not to see their children while they were detained, to spare them the trauma of seeing their father in a secure environment. Bernard, here in the second quote, spoke of how he would allow his partner to bring his baby daughter in to see him, but not his older son. He says, "I didn't want the big boy to come because he can see, he knows. I don't want him to think, oh, where is daddy? What is this place? You know, because he's 7 years old, he's very smart." So fathers were aware that being in detention, or the restrictions placed on them out of it, limited the extent to which they were able to be active and caring fathers. They saw the distress their absence caused to their children, and this could have a powerful effect. In Jambu's case, it caused him to regret the close relationship he'd built with his children, particularly his younger son, who he cared for as a baby on his own when his partner was in hospital. He said, "I had this sharp pain, you know, every time I remember him. I have this sharp pain in the lower part of my abdomen, as if someone's squeezing my heart whenever I remember him. And when I speak to the mum and she says, 'Your son is still crying and looking for you,' I mean, I had this horrible feeling of, you know, I wish I had known that something of this nature would happen. I wouldn't have been too close and attached to him." So he's arguing that caring less would have spared them both pain, and other men told similar stories. Jimmy told me that he was aware that each time he saw his son in detention, it could be the last time. And he also talked of distancing himself. And both these fathers argued that that sort of distancing or estrangement was what the system required. In Jimmy's words, "I think they're trying to take the emotion out of it." For Armand, the process was even more stark. Throughout his detention, the Home Office denied he had a daughter, despite the fact that she visited him regularly. And he said, "Not only are you sitting in a detention centre where you have no idea how long you're going to be there, you have no idea if you're going to be deported, the situation back in his home country is unbearable, a situation I cannot go to. They're insulting me again that I'm not a good parent. That said, the biggest resilience I had, the biggest strength I had, the biggest point of motivation and incentive was that I knew I had to win to continue being a dad." So he ends there with an expression of resistance and determination to fight to retain his relationship with his daughter. And such resistance is evident in the stories of a number of the men I spoke to. For some, it found expression in a with the law legal consciousness, using the law as a tool. For example, in his interview, Wilson demonstrated really detailed knowledge of Home Office policy and was talked about discussing his case with his lawyers, with a range of advocacy agencies, and with his MP. And when I interviewed Achuko in Brook House, he told me he had a copy of the immigration law handbook in front of him. Lawyers, he said, were just money makers, and he was learning the law and representing himself. He was taking some control of the situation, but that was very much in the context of the law's inability to help him. For these men, fighting to stay in the country was very much an expression of their love for their children. But despite those expressions of resistance, the fathers I spoke to didn't feel, in general, optimistic or hopeful about their relationship to immigration law. In Echoes of Singer's study, they described not being able to access legal advice, feeling stagnant or stuck, and feeling powerless to influence their situations. For example, here, Abdul expresses his disbelief at the attitude of immigration staff to his family life when they were attempting to deport him. "They said you can take your children with you." I say, "But they're British citizens. How can they? They can't change their lives and start again. They don't speak the language. They can't. And their mother, she'll not accept that." I told them that. They didn't pay any attention. They just want to deport you. And Armand described a long process of seeking legal advice, being disappointed by lawyers, learning aspects of the law himself. But despite all those efforts, he found himself powerless against the law, telling me, they've had all the documentations about my daughter, her school records and everything sent to them. They put all this evidence aside and totally ignored it. So both Abdul and Armand experienced that sense of powerlessness in detention, but they were subsequently able to resolve their immigration cases. And by the time I spoke to them, they had secure status and were rebuilding their relationships with their children. For others, though, the struggle continued. And I'd like to begin to draw this to a close by talking about Jimmy, who came to the UK to live with his aunt and uncle when he was 14. He formed a relationship with a woman in Edinburgh in his 20s, and his son was born. He was sent to prison after being, he was sent to detention after being in prison and was detained for 3 years. Some of that in Dungavel, where I met him. But at the time of our interview, he was living on cashless support in Glasgow with the threat of further detention and deportation ever present. And a sense of powerlessness imbued everything he spoke about in our interview. Even his being in the UK was something that he hadn't been in control of. And he saw everything that was happening to him now as something out of his own control. He said, I didn't get up at 14 and say, you know what, I want to go to England, pack my stuff and leave. No, it was a decision that was made for me by grown-ups, and I have grown-ups again making decisions for me again. And perhaps more than any of the fathers I spoke to, his experience exemplified an against the law legal consciousness. He was still at risk of detention. His bail conditions meant that he lived in a different city from his son, and he had no access to cash, and wasn't allowed to work. And as a result, even seeing his son was almost impossible. So as he saw it, the law offered no opportunities to him to change his situation. It only served to hem him in and close off any avenues that would enable him to be able to resume his life as the father of a child who was born in Scotland, which was the country Jimmy himself had made his home 10 years previously. And his summing up of the experience expressed his powerlessness, but also the extent to which the life that he was living was one of estrangement from his family, his friends, and from society as a whole. He said, it's like living in a dark hole, and you know there's no ladder. No one's throwing you a ladder to get out of it. You just have to hope and pray that one day the sun will just pass through so you can see a bit of light. But it's dark. It's really, really dark. You know, it's not like something that you would go out with your mates and say, you know, this and that and talk about. It's like a dark hole. So all the men I spoke to were caught up in a system that viewed them as problematic. Several were also cast as dangerous. But there were also fathers to children who'd been born in the UK who wanted to be present in their lives and to provide for them, care for them and love them. They experienced immigration law and specifically detention as a system that prevented them from being with their children and being active, involved fathers that they wanted to be. In some circumstances, they were able to resist, and this found expression in a with the law legal consciousness, but far more often their inability to influence their situations led them to experience an against the law legal consciousness, where the law was an oppressive force they were powerless to resist. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was excellent and shorter than the time. So we're going to have even more time for conversation. Can I encourage people to add in questions into the chat? Because I'm putting in all my own questions, so I don't massively want to be the one to ask all the questions. So please do put in questions for the speakers. So our last paper today is by our very own Andriani Fili. Andriani has been a research associate at the Centre for Criminology at the University of Oxford since 2014, where she's worked on a number of projects focusing on immigration detention. Andriani is also the managing editor and associate director of the Border Criminologies blog and social media accounts. She's currently doing a PhD at Lancaster University, in which she's mapping the racist history of the immigration detention system in Greece and recording resistance mobilized against it. This afternoon, Andriani is going to talk to us about immigrant women detained in Greece, hidden for their security.
Thank you, Mary. it's come to this point of the day where my room is too sunny, so I've been in a weird sitting position, so sorry about that. Anyway, I'm gonna share my screen. Yeah. Let me know if you can see.
Yeah. Yeah. But as long as you do the slideshow view. Yeah, perfect.
I can't see you, but I guess that's fine. Or I can't see myself, but anyway, probably better. Let me get to the first. Okay. So my presentation today stems from multiple projects over a 10-year period. It started with my research in the Petroleum Removal Detention Center in 2011, where I interviewed detained women, police officers, and administrative staff. My experience as an NGO practitioner in the airport detention facility and other centers in Athens between 2012 and 2013, and my in-depth research of the detention system since 2017 through a number of grants. So today I'm going to trace the detention of women through their acts of resistance, explore how these acts have been perceived by the authorities, and explain why resistance matters. I'm going to start with a quote by the director of the Petroleum Detention Center, who said to me, "The aim is to have peace, to have inmates that don't shout, don't resist, don't create problems, so that they have a nice time and we, the police, a better one." So let's see what happens when they shout, when they resist, and when they create problems, as he said. Women are detained in various locations in Greece, but due to the small numbers in Greece, they have been usually detained in one location. And while the Ellyniko detention facility was not the first stop, I'm going to start from there because what happened there was truly special. So in May 2015, women detained there began a hunger strike. When the women refused to eat, members from the newly founded Ministry of Migration Policy of the new leftist government visited to let them know that there was going to be a legislation change that would bring a 6-month limit to detention. To the women who were protesting, this meant that they would be released by September of that year. When October 2015 came and the women received a 3-month extension to their detention, they felt deceived. So they all decided to abstain from food. The police intimidated the women, so they all stopped apart from one, Sanat Aleb. 5 days later, on 5th of November, the police announced to her that she would be released. Instead, she was transferred to a basement at the Petroleum detention facility. When she was taken to the airport to be deported, she resisted. With handcuffs on, she was beaten, her hair was pulled while a police officer was holding her mouth shut. She was taken back to Petroleum, where a criminal case was built against her for disobedience and destroying police property, referring to her unruly nature. The next day, she was taken back to the Ellyniko facility, where another struggle had begun. The warden forgot to give her the medicine she needed and threatened to transfer her to a big prison, cultivating a climate of fear. While her court date was approaching, she was vindictively detained after another 6 months. All this time, she periodically went on hunger strikes and abstained from food. And for a week, she was hospitalized. However, she was only released a year after she was first taken there at the end of April 2016. During her trial in May that year, she was acquitted. Sanat Aleb may be an important figure of resistance against the violence of detention centers in Greece. However, she was not alone. If Sanat's protest began as a singular act of revolt, it rapidly garnered wider support from groups and collectives who often gathered in solidarity in the street in front of the detention facility. Her struggle was transformed into a powerful message for anti-deportation and anti-detention activism, with posters and banners declaring that her struggle is the struggle of all immigrants. The collective Solidarity to Detainees in the South, having formally established access to the center, played a key role by visiting them almost once or twice a week and taking their demands to the director of the center. As one member of the collective told me, what we did was suddenly we would go there in groups and the guards would not know what to do. We weren't aggressive, but we were 25 people demanding stuff the detainees wanted. The director felt they weren't in control, so we achieved simple stuff. And by that, he means keeping low numbers in detention, or keeping the cell doors open at night so that women can go to the toilet, give them shampoo and other cleaning items. On one of the regular visits, the women were out in the yard, refusing to go back inside. The director accused the collective of instigating this protest, so the next time they requested to see them, the police denied them entry for reasons of public order and for failing to prove a relationship of friendship between the collective and the women. In January 2017, the collective organized a demonstration protesting against the decision to stop visits. When they tried to communicate with the women, they were greeted by riot police who were there to stop them from having direct access to the center. When the police commander allowed the collective to visit those detained in the facility back in late 2014, the decision was interpreted as an attempt to keep their activities under close monitoring in order to prevent any extreme interventions and violent protests on their part. However, when women's everyday acts of resistance got entangled with organized and sometimes mass-based resistance from the outside, they eventually reacted. The day after the demonstration, the center was evacuated and women were transferred back to the Petroleum detention facility, allegedly for their security. In reality, this was a move to break the social interaction between solidarians and detainees and protect the inner workings of the system from outside scrutiny. This, of course, does not negate the fact that what happened inside and outside of the Lincoln facility was unique. If anything, how the police reacted is proof that resistance indeed matters. While the interplay between the solidarity movement and those in detention has been evident in other cases too, the duration of their involvement, the frequency of the visits, and the relationship built between the two parties has rarely been replicated. So we're back in the Petroleum detention facility. Based on interviews I've had with the authorities, anyone considered a control problem is transferred to the Petroleum Detention Center, which is indeed a notorious place that the CPT and other monitoring groups have condemned many times. Women there are visited by lawyers and by volunteers groups such as More Than the House of Women. Over the years, the groups have reported many hunger strikes and attempted suicides by the women, as well as serious allegations of ill treatment. In the women's words, nothing is legal here. Lies, harassment, sexual abuse, illnesses, rejection, filth, ill treatment, assaults, humiliation. Many reports describe a racist, sexist, and xenophobic environment. At the end of July 2020, a newly arrived woman had to be transferred to the doctor's office for her insulin injection. A male police officer volunteered to take her there, but instead she was taken to the garage where he assaulted her and attempted to rape her. The woman resisted, and after the incident, she sought legal help. This is not the first time sexual harassment by officers has been reported about the Petroleum facility. Alarmed that another statement of sexual abuse from the same center would be perhaps too much, the women yet another time were transferred to another detention center in Valesa without any prior notification. Now, what I have described so far is not unique to women. In fact, the police follow similar patterns in dealing with resistance. Such strategies are geared towards protecting the interests and defending the legitimacy of the institution, as well as exonerate the individuals involved. So one of the first strategy that happens almost by reflex is violence. The dynamic of women's resistance is conveniently washed aside with staff testimonies by dogmatic claims about the women's sexually deviant and subhuman nature. And if we can look at the quotes by detention officers at the Petroleum detention facility, one of them said, when they've learned to be abused, to be beaten up day and night, to be naked all day, you know, they keep them naked and they get sick and die, they get abused. So this monstrous behavior has had an effect on their psychology and behavior. They once wanted to hit me, they could have killed me. And another was said, Nigerians are like animals in a cage. Such anthroporacialism has deeply corrosive effects and justifies the women's maltreatment. Animals do not deserve to be treated as humans. Therefore, animalistic behavior on the part of detainees who want to escape from their cages can only be subdued through violence. And that's how they do it. The racialized nature of such matters was particularly evident in the narratives of criminality many officers attributed to some of those resisting. Another detention officer told me Nigerians create more problems. They are into voodoo and stuff, and you can't communicate with them. Moreover, they have a different mentality, a street mentality. They come here and become prostitutes, and they become harder than other women. Basically, they are men. So this is not only evident in their narratives, but also in the official response. Many of the detainees who have been involved in protest actions in detention are charged with criminal acts, such as revolting, civil disorder, grievous bodily harm against an officer, and a clear trend of criminalizing resistance. They are brought to the court without any means to defend themselves, and in most cases convicted for a variety of acts, ending up in prison for more or less long periods and often with a deportation decision. They disappear in prison where often NGOs and activists lose track of them. But even if contact is kept, it is nearly impossible to offer legal support due to the high expenses in felony cases. Now, the third strategy is the fabrication of manipulative subjects. At a meeting with the director of the detention center in Kos, he admitted that there had been at the center 2 attempted suicides. But as he said, they were fake. People who self-harm do not do it for real. They do not want to die, but rather to manipulate the situation to their advantage. In other words, to gain something, for example, a release. There is indeed no recognition in the official responses of self-harm as an extreme behavior that indicates distress, nor the potential for death to occur regardless of the primary motivation for self-harming behavior. This takes the burden off management for addressing the causes of these acts and places it on those committing the acts. The rationale is that self-harm is an attention-seeking matter that upsets the smooth operation of the institution. And this view of the police is deeply influenced by the vulnerability grading system of social workers, psychologists, and lawyers supporting those in detention. The system involves identifying releasable individuals and then appealing to the authorities to execute the release. Self-harm and other forms of bodily resistance are a red flag and are always employed by NGO support staff as an excuse for somebody's immediate release. So this has been a rather bleak representation of life inside Greece's detention facilities. And in this context, it is easy to think like the NGO practitioner interviewed who said, I don't know what the solution is, but it's utopic to think that there will be justice. You can't win the system or change it. But as I have tried to show here, state responses to people detained resistance prove that these acts are indeed a threat to the very object and purpose of immigration detention, which is to invisibilize and exhaust. Resistance upsets the regime and forces the system to adapt to it. And as we have seen, resistance inspires, provokes, generates, and encourages resistance. And I would like to end with a short clip from the demonstration outside the Liniko facility before it was violently evacuated. I hope you can. Sorry about that. So anyway, I'd like to end by saying that it's only if we are able to join their cries for freedom that we can hope that there will be no more places where people can be hidden away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andriani.